So as you know, this is a joint publication by the Institute of Economic Justice and ADRS. And this morning to present on this topic, we have Dr. Asghar Adelzadeh and Dr. Gilad Isaacs, who will be speaking to this topic and presenting some of the findings from this research paper. And just a little bit of context. I think the context for this paper and this presentation is high inequality in South Africa and high unemployment. And in this context, a basic income grant, or BIG, could have some positive effects in terms of redistributing income. So basic economic models predict that implementing some kind of a BIG would have negative impacts or consequences on the economy, specifically on the fiscus, or lead to an unsustainable fiscal path. But this report actually shows that there is no trade-off between a big program and economic growth and fiscal sustainability, and that a big could actually produce some win-win economic outcomes. So as I said, to speak to this topic, we have Dr. Asghar Adelzadeh. He is a co-director of a newly established economic modeling academy, which is located at Gibbs Institute in Johannesburg. He has extensive experience in econometric or economic modeling, specifically macroeconomic modeling, and some of his research and his work in that area has actually focused on South Africa. So we will have Dr. Asghar Adelzadeh presenting to us first, followed by a presentation and a commentary from Dr. Gilad Isaacs. And I will also just introduce Gilad before Dr. Adelzadeh speaks. Gilad is the Executive Director of the Institute of Economic Justice in Johannesburg. He's an economist at Wits University, where he coordinates the National Minimum Wage Research Institute. Gilad has a history, working experience as a consultant where he worked for the ILO. He also has a very extensive background in civil society activism, where he has worked for the Treatment Action Campaign and founded the Social Justice Coalition. So these are our panelists. I will now hand over to Dr. Asghar Adelzadeh, who will present for 30 minutes. Then we will have a little few seconds break, and then Gilad will come in to comment and also provide his thoughts on the presentation. So Dr. Adelzadeh, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Amala, and thank you for all of you to taking time to attend this meeting. I look forward to our engagement. As Jamala said, the topic is basically about the impact, the scenarios around the basic income grants and the macroeconomic and developmental impacts of selected scenarios. This is a presentation of a collaboration project between the ADRS and the IEJ. I'm Asghar Adelzadeh from Applied Development Research Solutions. Basically, I'm going to go over the project and the aim of the project, the model, give a short description of a model used for the project, and then talk about the scenarios that have been used to run the model with, starting with the base scenario or business as usual scenario, and 3 basic income pathway scenarios. And then I'll go over the results of the scenario and the policy implications and conclusions. Basically, the aim of the project has been to use economic modeling technique to quantify the macroeconomic and development impact of selected big scenarios and their implementation pathways. You may ask, why another modeling scenario? Why another modeling project? Why do we need another modeling study of the impact of big? And I think our initiative was based on three understanding that the models that have been used for studies by the DSD, the expert panel report, and by studies that were done for Treasury from the University of Stellenbosch, and also a study in the UCT, are built to closely reflect a particular view of a market economy that suffers from several interrelated, irremediable flaws, such as assumptions of full employment, perfect competition, perfect information, rational expectations. And these assumptions play important role in presenting in creating the outcome of the model and the conclusion of these reports. The report that we have we're presenting today spent a good amount of space on reviewing these studies and critically reviewing them and look at the modeling techniques that they use and issues relating to it. And we think that there are, other ways, other models that need to also look at the issue of the impact of a basic income grant, which we will present. The other reason for another modeling work is that the earlier studies that I referred to, they don't include big scenarios whose eligibilities and entitlement condition evolve over time. They're usually scenarios that are pay certain amounts throughout the simulation period, or and the coverage remains the same. We think that more realistic big scenarios or pathways, especially for implementation, should include periodic adjustments of the program to make sure that within a certain period, the program covers all poor adults and pay the decent grant amount. And you'll see that in the scenarios that we have developed and used for the project. And finally, there are several possibilities to fund the basic income grant program beyond using current policies on income tax and value-added tax, especially, for example, given the incredible level of wealth inequality in South Africa. It seems inevitable that a big funding pathway should include a wealth tax, and we have incorporated that in our modeling. So starting with the model, to give you a brief description of a model that we have used. It's a model built by the Applied Development Research Solutions that have, over the past 20 years, we've developed a suite of South African models that include a linked macroeconomic model of South Africa that basically linked a large macroeconometric model of South Africa to a macro simulation of households and individuals. And allows for the two-way interactions between the macro model impacts on the macro simulation, individuals, household, poverty, inequality, demand for social security, cost of social security, and then the aggregation of those costs and others feeding into the economy, to the government income and expenditures in the macro model, and reverberates in the economy, and again back and forth. The impact of the job creations, EPWP, income generation households impact obviously the macro simulation, and then again back and forth. So the model is a large model of integrated macro model. This is different from both models that have been used by DSD and also the University of Stellenbosch. In the case of DSD, you don't have a linked macro model. You have a macro model that is a CSG model, the general equilibrium model, and you have a macro simulation model that is sitting outside the macro model, and the two are not directly linked together or interacting with each other. In the case of Stellenbosch, there is no macro simulation model, so the modeling of the impact of basic income grant does not have the capability to look at the poverty and distribution impact of basic income grant. It is a DSGE model. So in this case, this is This is unique in terms of studying the impact of a basic income grant using a tool that has a two-way interactions between the macro model, and it is not a computable general equilibrium model. It's an econometric model that is built. The macro simulation component has modules, 5 tax modules: income tax, value-added tax, excise tax, wealth tax, and social security tax, and it has a number of social security modules, including basic income grant, and modules on poverty and inequality. Now, having said that, now to move into the scenarios, we start with the base scenario for the model, and the scenario plays. This is an important scenario to run in terms of capturing the working of the economy over the next 8 years to 2020-30. What if the economy stay in its business as usual scenario, basically, and in the current path? And also without the basic income grant, without a SRD grant. What if a scenario will go back to the before the COVID, without the SRD, without any basic income grant? What would be the outlook for the economy over the next 8 years? So therefore, this scenario sets up assumptions about fiscal policy in terms of, for example, government investment assumptions of growing at 6.5% annually, or government current spending go at 5%, public corporations investment going at 6.5%, monetary policies stay as they are, the social securities, will remain as the one before the system before the COVID-19, and basically no new policies are implemented over the next 8 years. So the model run this scenario and see what would be the outlook. And then when we run the basic income grant scenario, we can compare that to this base scenario to see what would be the impact of we be able to quantify the impact of the basic income grant scenarios. Now, when we run the model with the base scenario, with this scenario, it provides us a number of results, a summary of results in terms of the macroeconomic indicators. The average GDP growth rate would be about 2.2%, and there would be basically unemployment rate, average annual unemployment rate of over the next 8 years would be about 32.1%. The CPI and interest rates, you see inflation and average annual inflation and average interest rate and current account deficit. So you have a more or less outcomes that have been characteristics of South African economy after 2010, and especially after COVID, with the higher unemployment rate, above 30% unemployment rate remains in place. In terms of fiscal indicators, also the model shows that the total benefit paid relative to GDP would be average annual of 4.9%. Average income tax relative to GDP of 15.8%. Government expenditure GDP 31.8%, and others. And the deficit GDP ratio of about 3.3%, and average debt GDP ratio of mid-70s. In terms of poverty, the reductions in poverty of over the 8 years of about 21%, and the poverty gap, also depth of poverty, estimates of the gradual decline in poverty and gradual decline in the Gini coefficients in this scenario of about 9.8% reduction in Gini coefficients and debt and poverty and inequality. Now, in terms of now bringing in the basic income grant scenarios, the first scenario, before going to the scenarios, just a quick giving you an overview of the type of basic income grant that we have designed in terms of eligibility conditions. It's adult grant scenarios. All three scenarios are adult grant between 18 and 59 years old. The adults are not supposed to be receiving any other. They will be, as part of eligibility condition, they're not supposed to receive any other grants, and they need to pass a specified individual means test. It's means tested eligibilities. And then in terms of entitlement condition, the grants, they differ in terms of their monthly payments to eligible individuals. Each scenario, they're different. We're using the different poverty lines to identify the initial level of grants and how it evolves during the course of over the years. And all grants adjust to inflation, and also in terms of the important assumption is a take-up rate assumption that we assume in the simulation, that this introduction of these basic income grant is not right away 100% take-up, that it is a slow take-up starting from 60% during the first year and gradually every year increasing by 3%. By 2030, we estimate that about 81% of those eligible will be actually apply and receive the grant. So the model takes that to account. Now, to provide you the also in terms of what we have in terms of the various poverty lines that we have used in social relief of distress, each of them evolve over time. For each year that the model runs, it uses these values of the poverty lines and social relief of distress adjusted by inflation, and the grant amounts that are based on these poverty lines, they therefore adjust by inflation annually. In terms of just preparing for those scenarios, for the examination of financially feasible basic income grant, we have also we've looked at the wealth tax and social security tax, and the wealth tax module of the model basically looks at is linked to both the macro and the micro simulation model. In each period, at the macro level, the household wealth is estimated, is one of the econometrically estimated equations, the net wealth of the households, and then a percentage of that, like 1% is being considered as being eligible for wealth tax. And then that amount of that estimate of total tax then in the macro simulation uses the individual's income from the top quintile to extract that, to apply that the wealth tax on them and collect that estimated total wealth tax. The social security tax, it's a simple structure that basically applies a flat social security tax rate of 3% to wages up to a taxable maximum of 2.5%. It's a simple approach that can be further developed to include. It's just indicative in the sense of to show that it is possible to also fund as a possible funding of the basic income grant. And again, that is done through the wage income of the individuals and looking at their eligibilities and that is deducted and then provided to the social security program by the employees. Now, in terms of going quickly, in terms of the dynamics that the basic income scenario in the model, in the ADRS model provides, and the results, where these results come from, is a result of a number of dynamics that few of them worth mentioning. One is that the overall increase in household income and expenditure will stimulate production response from the economic sectors that in turn lead to higher investments, employment, and income. Higher growth domestic expenditure in the economy in terms of household consumptions and investment expenditure will especially generate higher value-added tax revenue that can also help finance the new grant. And the expected stimulus effect of a big program will benefit also the private sector, and their household income where the model captures that dynamic, that increase in output, increase in investments, obviously affects sectors of the economy and the private sector as a result. And the big scenarios, therefore, can also have positive aggregate demand and aggregate supply effects that the model quantifies, and you will see that as part of results of the model. Significant transfers to poor households will help obviously reduce poverty rate and depth of poverty. And as the bottom quintile becomes the main beneficiary of a big program, income distribution is expected also to improve. So these are some of the analysis that in the report. Obviously, the simulation results have been analyzed. These economic dynamics discussions have been used to explain the results. Here, I'm going to just quickly go over each of the scenarios and their findings. The first scenario that we have is we have three scenarios: low ambition, medium ambition, and high ambition scenarios. As I mentioned, one of the distinguishing features of the scenarios we have is that the scenarios evolve over time. So the low ambition scenario, for example, the mean stress starts with the food poverty line, but it gradually evolves over the next 8 years to upper bound poverty line. In other words, the coverage of the scenario increases over time rather than staying the same. And the same thing with the grant amount. Also starts, for example, in the low ambition with the SRD payment between 2023 and 2024, and it gradually by 2028, 2030, it is paying the lower bound poverty line amount. So that's one of the distinguishing features that I mentioned in terms of this modeling exercise. This scenario, as a result of the simulation, shows that the number of eligible increase for the grant increases starts from 9.38 million in 2023 and increases to 13.3 million by 2030, using the gradual absorptions. In terms of how this is getting, I'm trying to get rid of this. In terms of the cost and financing of this scenario, we have basically as part of the increase in the gross domestic expenditure as a result of the spending by the scenario, obviously the value added tax increases and government revenue increases, and that is part of the projects, the scenarios in terms of paying for the scenario. So that means, for example, in this scenario, the value added tax gradually increases. In the first year, increases by about 15.7 billion, and by 2030, and you can see that is the gray part here, gradually increases to about 67.6 billion. And that extra income from the government, from the VAT revenue due to the spending and the basic income grant, and increase in government, increase in household spending and consumption spending, and helps partly pay for the raises government revenue and helps pay for the basic income grant. Then the second part of the financing of the basic income grant, this is the line curve, is the cost of this scenario. Is the introduction of a wealth tax of 0.5% between 2023 to 2025, and increasing it to 1% between 2026 and 2030. And the combination of increase in VAT revenue and this increase introduction of a 0.5% and 1% wealth tax allows that to be able to finance the cost of the growth cost of the scenario. Obviously, if you look at how much the government income increases as a result of the program, and take that from the growth cost, so that gives you the net cost of the scenario, which is less. Then in terms of the impact of the scenario on what is the implication of the scenario, macroeconomic implication of it, it helps average annual GDP growth rate to increase by about 0.6%. As you can see, the per capita GDP also increases by, in real terms, by average annual by about 0.5%. Both aggregate supply and aggregate demand also, each of them increase in the economy. So you have a balanced growth. Unemployment rate, as a result, average annual unemployment rate declines from 32.1% in the base scenario to 29.7%. This is average annual decline in the unemployment rate of 2.4% as a result of this initial scenario, the low ambition scenario. And as you can see, the inflation and interest rates remains normal, and the current account deficit GDP ratio remains similar to the, more or less similar to the base scenario. In terms of fiscal impact of the scenario, obviously the total benefit paid GDP ratio increases from 4.9% to 8.5%, and that increase in the total payment, then you have there's an increase in the total taxes on income and wealth from 15.7 to 16.9%, about 1.2%. And as a result, you have, on the one hand, not only government expenditure GDP ratio increases from the base scenario of about 32 to about 35.6%, but also the revenue, government revenue GDP ratio simultaneously increases due to the VAT revenue increase, through the introduction of the wealth tax. And therefore, the debt GDP ratio and deficit GDP ratio remains more or less similar to the base scenario. It has doesn't impact those indicators. In terms of the impact on poverty and inequality, obviously key important driver reason for the introduction of the basic income grant. You'll see that the poverty rate declines by much faster, but 33% faster than the base scenario. And as a result, between 2023 and 2030, the poverty rate is expected to decline by 7.3% point more than the base scenario. At the same time, relative to base scenario, the low ambition scenario is expected to reduce the depth of poverty more significantly than the poverty rate, as you can see. And when you look at the impact, you're looking at assessing the impact of big on poverty. It is its impact on both poverty rates in terms of percentage of people moving out of poverty or remaining in poverty, and also the poverty gap. In terms of depth of poverty, the decline, its impact on the declining, reducing the depth of poverty are the two that one needs to look at, to appreciate the extent that the basic income grant help reduce poverty. Obviously, as a result of the benefits of the program being focused on the poor and low income household, and the injection being mainly to those, that also more significantly improved the income inequality. As you can see, relative to the base scenario, there is also decline in the Gini coefficient, or improvement in income inequality. Now, moving to the next scenario, the medium ambition scenario. In this scenario, we look at trying to capture or expand the scope or the eligibility condition for the grant, and also the grant amount. Here, instead of the food poverty line it starts with the lower bound poverty line as the means test, and increases gradually over the next 8 years to, by 2030, twice, 2 times the upper bound poverty line would be the means test. So we kept trying to capture a larger and larger number of poor adults as a result. And then the grant amounts also, instead of starting with the SRD in the base, in the low ambition scenario, it starts with the food poverty line and gradually increases to upper bound poverty line. So we have a dynamic scenario that gradually adjusts, trying to, over the next 8 years, expand the scope of and the eligibility and entitlement conditions for the grant. This scenario also captures basically the simulation shows that in 2023 about 9.45 million will be eligible, and it gradually increases to almost 15 million by 2030. In terms of the cost and financing of this scenario, this scenario obviously is a more expensive scenario relative to it. It covers more, it pays more, and it increases in terms of its cost from 78 billion in 2023 to about 373 billion by 2030. And as it expands, obviously its gross domestic expenditure effects, its expenditure effects on households increases. The VAT revenue also increases from about 27 billion in 2023. As you can see, this gray area gradually increases to about 130 billion increase in the VAT revenue due to that spending, that growth of spending. And then in order to catch the rest, to finance the rest of the gap between the increase in VAT revenue and the growth cost of the basic income, this low medium ambition scenario, we introduce a wealth tax of 1%. Starting from 2023 to 2033, and also introducing a social security tax in 2028 of 3% over the last 3 years of the scenario. And a combination of these will the model shows that it's enough to finance the scenario. What would be the impact of this in the dynamic impact of these spendings and the household income expenditures and taxations and all of that is that at the macroeconomic level, the average GDP ratio is now annual increase. The average annual GDP growth increases by about 1%. And as you can see, both aggregate supply and aggregate demand increase. Unemployment rate declines to 28. Average annual unemployment rate declined to 28.2, which is about 3.9% point decrease average annually compared to the base scenario. And the CPI and the again interest rate and current account remain more or less within the range of base scenario. Now, in terms of the major decline in the 4%, almost 4% average annual decline in unemployment rate, and 1% increase in average GDP growth, or significant impact of the scenario. In terms of the fiscal impact of this, simultaneously the model generates a fiscal impact of this, aggregates the cost from the macro simulation, feed into the macro model, and it captures this dynamic feedback effects, and eventually the final results show that while the total benefit GDP ratio increases from 4.9% of GDP spent in benefit paid to 10.8%, at the same time government expenditure GDP ratio, obviously it shows that shows up in the increase in government expenditure GDP ratio from 31.8 to 38%, but at the same time the revenue GDP ratio also goes from 28.8 to 34.8%. So while the expenditure increases, the model also captures the government income increases, both from the VAT revenue and from the introduction of wealth tax and social security tax. And as a result, you have a basically debt GDP ratio that is more or less remains stable and relative to the base scenario. In terms of what would be the impact of the major outcome of this scenario in terms of its impact on poverty, this is much more significant impact. The second scenario has on poverty would be almost twice, 2.5 times higher its impact on poverty compared to the base scenario. So you have a 55.3% decline in the poverty rate. Poverty gap significantly declined relative to base scenario, much more, almost 100% decline in the poverty gap, depth of poverty, almost eradicating the poverty, depth of poverty. And because this is an adult grant, it is not, it is limited in that sense. Otherwise, it is, it captures, it is able to significantly reduce the poverty gap. And as you can see, the Gini coefficient, the inequality also declines significantly relative to the base scenario. Finally, we have the high ambition scenario, and this scenario is looking at gradually moving the base. And what if the big scenario gradually move towards universal basic income grant? This is a step toward that kind of a scenario, and it looks at much larger scope of for the means test, 2 times the upper bound poverty line, starting that in terms of capturing poor adults, to increase to about 6 times the upper bound poverty line as the means test. And the grant amount, again, starts with the full poverty line and increases to upper bound poverty line. And this scenario captures about 11.1 million eligible for in 2023, and increases gradually to about 19.8 million by 2030. In terms of the cost and financing of the scenario, obviously the larger number of the eligibles means the cost of the scenario is higher, and it is partly paid by the increase in the VAT revenue, which in this case is from increases in the initial year, about 38 billion increase in the VAT revenue in 23, and then increases to about 172 billion by 2030. We have increased. So while its largest spending is happening for the basic income grant, it shows up in household, especially poor households' income and expenditure and tax revenue that the government will receive, and that part of the supporting payment for it. Then it is also the rest of the gap is paid by 4% social security tax, and which is this in the last 3 years, and the wealth tax of 1% from 2023 to 2030. So a combination of increase in VAT revenue, 1% wealth tax, and 4% social security tax from 2028 is more or less able to pay for this for the scenario. In terms of its impact on that level of spending, injection in the economy, and dynamism, its impact on the economy, it has a average GDP growth increases by about 1.2%. We have which means that the per capita GDP, an average annual increases by about 1%. There is a unemployment rate declines by about 4.9%, almost 5% average annually, from 32.1% base scenario to 27.2%, and the CPI and the interest rates remain acceptable within the range of the base scenario. In terms of the fiscal impact, again, same story, that higher spending, higher government expenditure GDP ratio here as a result of this high ambition scenario is also accompanied with higher revenue GDP ratio, both the VAT revenue, tax, wealth tax, and social security tax, and therefore the difference between the two will give you a deficit GDP ratio and the debt GDP ratio, which and in terms of the poverty impact of this scenario, this is even more effective in terms of it reduces poverty rate by almost two-thirds, 61 percentage points, reduces poverty gap by about 83.6%, and reduces the income inequality Gini coefficient by 19 percentage points. Now, in terms of the overall, give you the overall picture of the impact of this scenario. If you look at the gray, this is the base scenario. We're looking at the GDP growth, unemployment, poverty rate, poverty gap, inequality, and debt GDP ratio. In case of base scenario, no basic income grant scenario, business as usual, no SRD and no basic income grant scenario, we're looking at the outlook for the next 8 years of 2.2% average GDP growth, unemployment rate of average annual of 32.1%, poverty rate of minus reductions of 21%, poverty gap reductions of minus 25%, inequality declining by about 10%, and debt GDP ratio about 74.2%. As the three basic income scenarios that you have, the low, medium, and high ambitious scenario, helps raise the average GDP growth rate gradually, depending on the scenario, all the way from 2.2% to high ambitious scenario of 33.5%. It reduces the unemployment rate of average annual unemployment rate from 32% gradually by the high ambitious scenario will be 27.2%. Poverty rate also significantly increased by 2/3 in this case, and about 50%, more than 50% in this middle ambitious scenario. Poverty gap, depth of poverty significantly declines, 83%, more than 80%. Inequality also significantly declined, and the debt GDP ratio remains more or less in the mid-70s. Just to conclude, we basically use the model to quantify the dynamically integrated macro model. We use that to quantify the macroeconomic and development impact of these alternative pathways. And they show that the results show that the three scenarios, the three big pathways, are each effective policies to significantly reduce poverty and inequality to varying degrees. For example, medium and high ambition scenarios are able to reduce income poverty by half and by almost 2/3 by 2030, respectively. That means the big program is undoubtedly a poor social policy program. In addition to their significant desired impact on poverty and inequality, the scenarios also have tangible positive macroeconomic outcomes in terms of growth and employment, especially. And our simulations of the three big pathways show that the combination of a relatively small wealth tax and social security tax can provide the necessary complementary resources that enable government to introduce and sustain the program over time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for that, Dr. Delzadeh. Okay, I would like to invite Dr. Gillard Isaacs to just give us a few thoughts on that presentation. We'll give you about 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the attendees. Thanks, Gillard.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Chair. I think I'll be able to be less than that because it would be great to hear from everyone. And thanks very much to Asghar for that excellent input and our partnership on this work. I'm not going to speak to the details of the output, which Asghar's done exceptionally well, but rather to sort of put this in its policy context. And the last time I had the pleasure of sharing a platform with ADRS and Asghar was actually probably now about 7 or 8 years ago, when we were doing work on the implementation of a national minimum wage. ADRS did an excellent modeling exercise at that time, also showing on a pathway for the implementation of 4 national minimum wage scenarios. And this was in the contestation and sort of heat of attempting to develop a policy framework for implementing that national minimum wage, which of course came into being. And I mention this not only anecdotally, but because actually this sort of context has numerous parallels and this modeling context also. The first parallel is that we are confronted with a situation where the conventional wisdom is that a policy that is pro-poor, that is pro-development, is then cast as being unsustainable and having negative macroeconomic outcomes. In the case of a national minimum wage, the modeling and the rhetoric was that if we implemented this, we would have widespread unemployment, up to 500,000 jobs lost, and this implosion in the economy. The research that has been done subsequently by the same people, ironically, who did the sort of doomsday modeling has shown that that did not in any meaningful way occur. The other parallel is that ADRS's modeling was in sharp contrast to that conceived wisdom at that time, and actually showed that there were abilities to responsibly implement that policy, and the outcome, which we've seen, is far closer to the projections from the ADRS modeling of that time. So, you know, those interesting parallels around the manner in which policy is spoken about, as well as the very different types of results from modeling which one receives based on the assumptions which you use, as well as the credible outputs which we've seen previously from the work of Asghar and his team. You know, in terms of this policy context, I wanted to say sort of three things which also sort of springboard off this. The first is that one of the reasons I think this is such a valuable exercise is that, as the cliche goes, you know, this is in any policy, the devil is in the detail, and you know, we could have the implementation of a basic income grant, and it could have significantly different impacts on South Africa, depending on how it is designed. And what this exercise allows us to do is to play with those design options and see what the projected outcomes based on the modeling architecture and assumptions, and of course all models make their assumptions, and so based on those you are able to see what the outcomes might be, and that's a really important part of the policy process, and why I think it's really important for policymakers to engage with these, and in particular to engage with these as evolving scenarios, which, as was said, they are scenarios which provide a pathway to different end goals. The second is that, you know, we're often asked, and again, we're asked at the time of the national minimum wage, well, okay, which scenario do you prefer? Which one are you advocating for? And that's never a sort of straightforward answer, right? You put forward scenarios not as a prescriptive exercise. You put forward scenarios to illustrate, if you do X, Y, Z, what might the outcome be. It is worth noting from a policy point of view, some of the kind of four components which the IJ and Basic Income Coalition and others consider to be fundamental. And you obviously see these featured in the scenarios. And I just want to mention some of those. The first is for a unconditional adult grant. So this is not tied to work-seeking behavior or enrollment and so on. And that's a really important feature and has been shown to have positive impacts. The second is that the value is, whilst the SRD is a basis, uses the poverty lines and progresses from the food poverty to the upper bound poverty line. The third is that the means test is at least at the upper bound poverty line. The fourth is that the financing is not regressive tax measures. So, for instance, financing from VAT, which would put a burden on the poor. The fifth is that there is parity for a child support grant. The sixth is that it doesn't displace other grants or public like services. And the seventh is that this is a progressive pathway towards universality. And in differing ways, these scenarios capture aspects and various combinations of those. So from our side, it's not about announcing a preferred scenario, but utilizing this as a credible exercise to explore the potential impact, as well as having certain policy frameworks. What I should have actually mentioned, I had planned to mention when talking about some of the parallels between the national minimum wage and basic income grant modeling, which I just want to sort of go back to, sorry to interrupt that flow, and add is one of the other interesting features is that in both instances, the available empirical evidence, so the evidence which we have on what's actually happened when these policies have been implemented elsewhere in the world. And of course, in a basic income grant, we don't have a universal sort of like framework in the way that we do for like a national minimum wage. But the empirical evidence, which we've seen, and recently there's a study coming out of Kenya, very much is incongruous with the type of like modeling results which we've seen presented here in terms of the impact on poverty and its sustainability within the economy. The third and last thing I want to say is a note of caution, I think, to all of us, which is that all of these scenarios, rightly in our view, use the SRD grant as a basis for their implementation. What we need to be aware of is that in the modeling, we assume away, I don't know if that's the right phrasing, but the sort of current deliberate obstacles being placed in the way of recipients accessing the SRD grant are not featured there, right? Because those deliberate obstacles are ones which we wouldn't want to see in place. And this speaks to a court case which the IEJ and partners have launched against government, because in fact there are deliberate existing obstacles which government is putting in place to exclude those who are eligible. So the reason I raise this is even before we can take the first step on the type of pathways which Asgard so cogently laid out for us, we must recognize that we have one foot tied to the banister, and actually walking these pathways is increasingly difficult. So I just want to thank ADRS for their work. This represents their modeling, yeah, share those thoughts to situate this in terms of the South African policy conversation. Thanks very much, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Gillett. Thanks for those comments. I will now open the floor to anyone who has questions. If you can just raise your hand, unmute yourselves, and then I will take questions. I see there's also questions in the chat. Maybe we can start with that while people kind of gather their thoughts. The first one, it's from Maya Fisher French, and it says, at what level is the wealth tax implemented? What would the NAV be? I'm not sure what the NAV means, but the question is at what level is the wealth tax implemented?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please. Anyone
Okay.
can just jump in.
Okay. Well, it depends on the scenario. The three scenarios that we have start from 0.5% to 1%. So, and it's a question of whether it starts from 2023 or all the way to the end of the simulation 2030, or later on it starts with 0.5% and then increases to 1%. But the range is basically 0.5% to 1%.
Okay, there is another question here which is quite long, but I will read it out. It's from Tony. It says, how do you increase GDP by simply redistributing the same pool of money? Why has GDP growth shown no growth while grants increased significantly over the past decade? And then, yeah, I think the rest is just a bit of an elaboration on that. Did you get that, Asghar?
Yes, and I'll give my thoughts, and Gillard may have also some observation on that. It's basically it is not redistributing. The economy is a dynamic entity, so it is evolving as we are, as we're moving forward, and there is a lot of various aspects sectorally and demand and supply side, factors and prices that are basically impacting the economy from various angles. So it is, and one of the major aspects of it in economics factors that affects the growth of the economy is aggregate demand, what is called aggregate demand in the economy. It's not the only factor, but it is in this case as a for basic income grant is an important factor, where through redistribution, that is, the basic income grant and spending to households that are poor, especially bottom two quintiles, and or in this case, all the adults, poor adults, they are increase their income and they're spending their demand in the economy. Aggregate demand includes household consumptions and investments, and that will stimulate basically to satisfy that demand, it pushes supply side of the economy go up. Sectors have to respond to increased expansion of production of food, clothing, everything, transportations and electricity, everything production in order to respond to that increased demand, and that helps economic growth. It's not a zero-sum situation where you take from one, you put another, and you say, well, how that doesn't obviously work. No, it is not it's not like that. I don't know if Gilad wants to add, and why GDP has not grown. The issue of the South African growth and why South Africa is stuck in low growth is much more complicated, much more beyond, goes much beyond the being singling out the social security as being, or jumping into any conclusion like saying therefore social security spending is not effective. That's definitely needs much more conversation, and there are many more various policy levers involved and dynamic of the economy, structure of the economy, all that involved in terms of the why the South African economy has been in low growth path for so long.
Thanks. And just Jamila, I do see that Maya Fisher-French has a follow-up in the chat as well as her hand up, just on the wealth tax issue. Two quick thoughts on the grants and on GDP growth. The first is that it's important to acknowledge that for the last decade, on average, the existing grants have basically either kept pace or grown below inflation. So we haven't seen a increase in existing social grants, and therefore, if your policy measure is, it's impossible to, if essentially they losing value, one can't extrapolate from that what the macroeconomic impact might be. The second thing is that there are differing propensities to consume in the economy, and we know for a fact that the lower income households have a higher propensity to consume than upper income households. We know that a fair share of wealth is stored, that is also moved offshore. And we know from input-output analysis, which we undertook a few years ago, using the income and expenditures surveys that and the input-output tables, that lower income households consume a higher share of their consumption baskets on locally manufactured goods than upper income households do. So all of that gives some that gives credence to the idea that a redistribution, which obviously occurs in part but not the only factor here, is likely to have a positive macroeconomic impact. And of course, this gels with the international evidence. The international evidence on social transfers and grants in particular is covered by a paper which Dr. Kelly Horson and Zimbali Ncube published for ERSA last year, which I asked colleagues to put a link to. We know from groups like the IMF and World Bank and so on that poverty and inequality are a growth retarding. So all of these factors, I think, logically underpin the kind of results which we've seen here, if not their magnitude and specificities.
Okay, thanks, Gilad. Okay, so the follow-up question from Maya is, she says, my question is, who pays the wealth tax? So in other words, what must the taxpayer earn, or what net asset worth must the person have to pay the wealth tax?
In terms of the modeling, as I think as Gilad says, you have to realize the modeling world and the real world, there's some differences, significant important differences between this and the implementation. And the sense of indicativeness of the scenarios and illustrative purpose of it is important to keep in mind. The way that we have introduced the wealth tax is that we have time series data on households' net worth and net worth in terms of both in terms of income and financial assets and physical assets and all that. And we know that by many studies that the wealth is highly concentrated in South Africa, and that's basically household wealth is highly concentrated. So when we have an estimate of a total wealth in the in terms of time series data that we have, we know that the large amount of that large portion of that wealth is concentrated in the hands of the top 10%, 1% and 20% of the population. So what we have done is that basically use that we have in the model, we have a projection of the evolution of we capture the evolution of that net worth of households. Every year, how much does it grow based on regression analysis? And we use that estimate that we have in terms of evolution. And each year we say, well, the 10% of this should be taxable, or we should apply 0.5% tax on certain amount, not all of the wealth of the household, but let's say 10% of that. And we estimate that, and if we apply 0.5% on 10% of that estimate of tax, it gives you a total wealth tax that you're expecting to collect. Now, in terms of who pays that, then the micro simulation part of the model goes and pick up in every individual. There are 130,000 individuals in the micro simulation with their weights for the population, and there are 62,000 families, 30,000 households, and we know what quintile they are in, the top quintile or bottom quintile, and then we go and that code, the right computer codes to go and test and capture those top quintile basically households in terms of capture that tax amount, that estimated wealth tax from that top quintile. So this is the approximation that we have done in terms of capturing translating a macroeconomic estimation on the one hand of the wealth net worth of households, translating it to who pays for it, and using the top quintile based on the concentration risk to pay that percentage of the wealth tax. It is not applied to everybody's wealth. It's only applied to the top quintile, and it's only applied to 0.5% of that top quintile's wealth. So that's how we have it. It's not necessarily perfect. There's a lot of limitation on the data about wealth. There are other ways of doing these things. Actually, IEJ has a report that has a large number of possibilities of financing big in terms of transaction tax and other wealth tax and other social security tax, progressive social security tax. There are many options. These are that we can that as Gilad says, that we don't need to use a regressive tax measure to pay for a basic progressive idea. There are especially in an unequal society like South Africa that the wealth is so concentrated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Asghar. Okay, so there is a question from Peter. He says, so his question is about financing this through the wealth tax. To what extent does the model incorporate a tax avoidance reaction from those facing the wealth tax? Is there anywhere in the world where wealth taxes have been successfully applied in terms of collecting the expected revenues and compliance costs?
Okay. The tax avoidance, the model is not looking at the tax avoidance, and basically it can be, the tax avoidance can be always used in terms of modeling word as a percentage of the amount that the model estimate that actually gets collected. The same thing we have, for example, on the issue of the introducing basic income grant, whether there will be 100% take up or gradual. We start, as I mentioned, we have a gradual take up. What's the actual number to use, and that those are all variables. Those are parameters that one can do estimations in there. In terms of experience around the world, there are many places that do have wealth tax, various types of wealth tax, and that are, there's a good amount of literature on that in terms of wealth tax, from financial wealth tax to inheritance tax to a whole range of fiscal and financial, various type of tax that are different parts of the world that they use to different extent and different success. So I leave that there. I don't know if Gillard, you have anything else?
Yeah, thanks. So interestingly enough, Peter, our team is actually working on a paper which reviews like this. So a sneak preview of some of this. I mean, they argue that when thinking about a net wealth tax in particular, one can think about its success on three elements: about how much revenue it raised compared to its expectations, whether it achieved its stated intention, and how poor it was in the manner in which it raised its revenues. And they identify sort of 14 or so countries which they look at, both developed and developing countries, generally the share of revenue which it raises is somewhere between 1% and 5% of the tax intake, which, sort of 5% of South Africa's tax intake, sorry, off the top of my head, like roughly, I think corresponds, it's about 70 billion rand. Some estimates put from the SCIS put the intake at various points, and then they undertake various case studies which look at this, whether it's once off, whether it's every year. Colombia, for instance, stands out as an interesting case study that's had sort of different iterations of a wealth tax. So yeah, I think in terms of, of course, wealth taxes have been more and less successful in various contexts. But that paper, which sort of dives into your question quite some depth, will be out in the first quarter of next year.
Okay, thanks, Gellert. Okay, there's a follow-up question from Peter. It says most households' net wealth is concentrated in illiquid assets, housing, corporate ownerships, etc. They won't have the cash sitting in the bank. Did you factor this in the market impact of sudden liquidation?
Just to say before Asghar sort of comes in, this is often an argument used against wealth taxes in general. And I think the important thing to bear in mind here is who you are applying this wealth tax to, and whether or not that claim actually holds with regards to the share of people you are applying the wealth tax to. And generally, when you're applying it to the wealthiest share of the population, there's also substantial income flows simultaneously. My personal view is that if someone is sitting on a mansion in Forest Town and has to pay a wealth tax on that and can't afford it because of a lower income flow, and they have to sell that and move to a mansion in Saxonwold to free up a bit of income, to pay for a basic income grant. I have very little sympathy for that, and so be it. But anyway, let me allow for a more considered answer.
No, I'm with you on that. Look, it's the house. If policies are being adapted and implemented, and people have to adjust and figure out how they do, make the payments. If you have it's not just physical. Those people who we're talking about top quintile in South Africa and top 10%. They have financial assets. Financial assets is pretty easy to sell, the bonds and equities and a whole range of things. So it's not and they also have a lot of cash. It's not the households at that level is not really cash strapped in terms of. It's like any program, the first year takes adjustments. Gradually, everybody have to come there. So as long as the system is serious in terms of collecting the tax, then the households and everybody will figure out how they have to adhere to that rule. So the implementation side of it, I don't think means we have to disregard, especially in a place that is most equal country in the world, to not consider how do you deal with the inequality in the country at the same time you have about 50% of the population living in poverty. It's that's a lot more serious than households on the top figuring out how to how to come up with paying their taxes at that level.
Okay, thanks, Gillett. A few seconds, and then I'll give Neil a chance, and then I also have a question. So, Gillett, you literally have 30 seconds.
I just wanted to sort of jump off that point and say that the financing modalities are important, and they are important both in the modeling and in the policy implementation. But we should recenter what the basic income grant is all about, and we should recenter the crisis of hunger, which we face in South Africa, and have a conversation also about the real material impacts which this lifeline is currently and can continue to offer.
Okay, thanks, Gillett. Neil, I see your hand is up. Neil, are you there?
He's on mute.
Yeah, he is on mute.
He may be talking, but it's on mute. Yeah.
I'll send him a message on WhatsApp. Okay, so maybe he will come back to us. Okay, so what my question is a little bit on the financing, but I saw on your charts that it was a combination of wealth tax and VAT, and the other one was social security tax. I was wondering what that is, and also just in terms of the discussion around, this, the impact not being regressive on, the poor households or taxpayers, or not households, but not taxpayers, but households. Isn't there an element of it being regressive if part of it is paid via VAT as well?
Okay. the VAT part is not through increasing the VAT rate. It's the current VAT rate continue, and the current the income tax also, the brackets stay, the income tax, those do not change. It's the volume that is increases, because you have, like, let's say 15% or 13% average, that it applies to a larger amount of the spending in the economy. Therefore, there's a larger amount gets collected. So in that sense, it is not it's not increasing that rate compared to, for example, in the expert panel, the proposal on increasing the value-added tax rate, that's increasing it from 15% up. That's different. In terms of the social security tax, it is basically, it's a tax on formal employment. Which is basically here is I think in one scenario, I think we've used that in two scenarios from 2028 to 2030, and it's like 3%, and then another, the high ambitions is a 4% for those 3 years of basically the income wage earners. Formal employed wage earners, and it is usually collected by the employer. And in some cases, like in the US, the employer also contributes to that. And then together, the employers deposit that on a social security account, government account, every month. So it doesn't apply to everybody. It doesn't apply to, only those with formal employment. And then it has a threshold of, we've used 2.5 million. A year income, that it is 3%, multiply that amount, and the more you're receiving annually, up to 2.5 million. After 2.5 million, it is the 3 times 2.5 million for everyone. As you can see, this obviously can change. It can be different tiers, different, develop these things, design these things differently. But it is being used as a way of funding social security by employees. It helps especially the middle class, for example, come to the picture, and the upper class to pay end up being the main contributor to that the social security for everyone, and then everybody will benefit. Let's say the basic income grant, it helps, it pays for all the adults, for example, or whoever is is covering. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm not sure, because I see Neil sent a message in the chat. He says he raised his hand, but apparently there are 2 Neils in the room, so maybe I have the wrong Neil. But if Neil is there and would like to ask a question, you may.
I've been informed that the Neil with his hand up may actually be Tebogo. So if we can give that Neil speaking rights and call on Tebogo, then maybe that will solve the problem. Can we, Tebogo?
Yes, no, thanks. Okay, no, I now see the confusion. Yeah, no, thanks for for the presentations. I was very, very, very impressed by the way the scenarios are presented, and as you said, Isaac, that the point here is to show that whatever options we take, I'm saying to the policymakers, that option is it's very, very, very clear to it what its outcome will entail. Yes, before I say something, I think my name is Tebogo Padu, and I received this invitation through the work we are doing with regard to the ANC process of a manifesto. And one of the things that I thought that could be useful, because you might have been aware that some few months ago, the ANC released what it called manifesto review, basically indicating, what has happened in the last 5 years, which is almost 5 years since the last election, and what are the new proposals for the 2024 manifesto. So it's not just looking at the past, but also suggesting some of the policy interventions it might advance. So in that context, I think the study could be very useful, because as you understand that the ANC conference, together with our allies, the allies of the ANC, COSATU party, have taken a strong position in favor of a universal basic income grant. And currently there are discussions of how we can shape the manifesto to reflect those policy priorities or policy positions going forward. Now, part of that could be that, supporters of BIG, advocates of BIG, research around this is also carried into the alliance processes, so that, we can back up, the case for NHI. And as you know, we are always countered when you have powerful resolutions that addresses the needs of the poor majority. And I think this is one of them, where we're more likely, if we are not already, facing resistance from those who will argue that, where will the money come from? Where will the money come from? It's a usual thing when you talk about the cries of the poor. But when you make a tax cut for the rich, such questions are not raised. But when it comes to the poor, these are all, and it's so difficult if you don't have a technical, resource to back up to counter those claims. So it is from that context, I wanted to say that first, let us respond to the manifesto review. Those who support, not necessarily IJ and ADRC, only ADRS, but also other organizations. I will appeal to that. The manifesto is expected to be released early next year. I don't have the dates to formally confirm that, but I think it's important that we engage with this process of a 2024 manifesto by having a session with those involved, and I could share the details after this with the organizers, so that we can have what is the economic case for BIG? Is it affordable? These are issues that actually scare people off when there's nothing on the table to back the case. So I think this study is very, very timely, and in that context, that will be my proposal. Sure.
Thank you. Thanks, Deborah. That was very interesting and helpful. I'm sure our panelists would love to take that forward with you. So please do keep in touch. So we are at exactly 11:30. I don't know if you want to respond to Deborah quickly, Aska and Gilad.
I think, because I'm far away, I think maybe Gilad can, obviously this report is a collaboration that we have done for exactly the purpose that you have and others, and if it can be utilized to promote discussions and deliberation, the best, I think, way is to to have established a strong tie with the IEJ to facilitate this. And ADRS will be happy to do its share of whatever needs to be done. I really support the sentiment, the idea. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Asghar. Gilad, in closing.
I'd just like to say some thanks on the IJ side to Kelly Horson, Carolee Osborne, and Neil Coleman, who have all inputted here, and Dali Veyers from the com side, and yourself, Chair. And then from the ADRS side, the heavy lifting of the modeling is obviously done by Asghar and his team, as well as we've worked with his comms, the ADRS and EMA communications team and designers. So, just to thank everyone for their input into this, and we will look forward to there's some other summaries coming out next year. There's some policy analysis around like this work, which will be shared, but this report provides the core foundation for a detailed assessment of the issue, and to thank everyone, Asghar in particular, for the work done in this.
Thank you. Thanks, Gilad. Thanks, Asghar, and thanks
Can
to
I also give a word of thanks? I didn't know we're finishing. I just want to reciprocate what Gilad said. Everyone that he mentioned, we spent more than a year on this. Have had numerous meetings and discussions around scenarios and results and discussions. So it's I'm grateful to be part of that the team that worked on this idea, and to put forward an alternative to the mainstream economic thinking about the basic income grant, from not just the modeling side, from the scenario side, from the issues of the priorities, the funding mechanism, the pace of the scenarios in terms of going forward. So everyone mentioned, and I think will in team and others who have participated. I appreciate the opportunity to work together and look forward to spread the word on this document. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.